Mr. Peck, I want to thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
So you're not encouraged by this growth. Why?
Well, there are really two reasons. One is, you're right, we've had good growth starting in the third quarter and really strong growth in the fourth quarter of 2009. And if that growth persists, then eventually strong job growth must follow. But there are many reasons to think that it may not. The stimulus was responsible for a lot of the growth that we've seen so far, and that as a concentrated force is petering out. I think there's a substantial chance that the strong growth that we've seen may not persist. Even if it does, though, there are good reasons to think that job growth will lag. That's what's happened in every recession since the early 1980s. In fact, in each recession since then, jobs have come back slower and slower.
Now, you expect a few groups to suffer the most. One you name is young adults. Why is that?
Well, unemployment is really high among teens and 20-somethings right now, and I went into the reporting thinking that young people would probably be spared the recession's worst scars. You know, they're in and out of the workforce anyway. They don't have a lot of responsibilities. But in fact, there's a lot of research that shows that the first few years, once you kind of come onto the job market, are really, really important to your career track. And if you don't find solid roots in the job market within a year or two, it permanently diminishes your earnings for the rest of your career. Even people that do find jobs, in fact, early in a recession, as they're coming out of college, say, don't do as well 10, 20, 30 years later as people who come out in normal times.
But how would this be different for these college graduates than for any others that have graduated into a recession?
Well, the only difference really is the depth of the recession and what I think will be its length. So, you know, I think we're only a couple of years into maybe a 5 or 6 year period of highly elevated joblessness.
Who else is going to be affected the most severely?
Well, I mean, the recession, it's been called the man-cession, and that's true, again, in part because construction and finance are male-dominated. 3/4 of all job losses since the recession began have been to men, and that really is part of a longer-standing trend. Just recently, for the first time in U.S. history, women held more jobs than men in the U.S. When men don't work, marriages tend to sour pretty quickly, so I think that if male joblessness persists, you're likely to see a rise in divorce rates. Women legally initiate 2/3 of all divorces, and I think you might see a wave of them heading forward. And I think you're also likely to see delayed family formation. You know, people put off marriage in recessions, but in a kind of new development for less affluent communities, they increasingly don't put off childbearing. So again, the longer this malaise stretches, I think the more you're likely to see single-parent homes.
Do you think that childbearing has been a result of the recession?
When people, I don't think it's a result of that. I mean, again, there's been some good academic research which has shown that this is a difference from past generations, that childbearing just doesn't have much relationship to incomes anymore, but marriage rates do. So for less affluent people, they'll put off marriage. They're not comfortable marrying when one of the people is jobless, but they won't put off children. Children are seen as a great source of meaning.
But is that true? Some critics would argue lower income women may have more children because then they get more welfare assistance.
Well, I think that's much less true now than it was in the 90s, you know, with welfare reform. That's eliminated some of those incentives, but that may have something to do with it.
Now, you believe blue-collar men, working-class men, are being affected more than others and will be. Is this having a greater toll on minority communities?
The inner cities are a real source of worry, I think, in this recession. Urban minorities, and especially, again, urban men, are among the first fired and the last rehired in recession. So even after we, on national figures, get out of this, we're likely to see inner cities with very high joblessness, and over time that creates a lot of social dysfunction.
Like what? What's happened in the past, or what do you see happening now?
Well, when young men can't find jobs, they sell drugs and do drugs and drink, and that creates, you know, a lot of a lot of social problems, a lot of family problems, a lot of crime and violence.
What impact do you think all of this will have on politics?
When recessions really, or periods of malaise really go on for a number of years, people begin to ask questions like, how am I doing relative to my parents? How are my children likely to do? And when they answer those questions negatively, when they lose the sense that they're getting ahead, they become a lot more jealous of their status relative to other people in society. Society tends to become more mean-spirited, less inclusive. Anti-immigrant sentiment tends to increase. Racial tensions often increase. So I think that, again, the longer this goes on, the more you're likely to see those sorts of problems emerge or reemerge in the U.S. And that's socially problematic, and it creates for very divisive politics as well.
Well, speaking of divisive politics, we seem to be seeing that now with the Tea Party movement. But how does that fit into your argument? They appear largely an anti-spending, anti-big government, anti-taxes movement. On the surface, they don't appear to be anti-immigrant or saying, I'm jealous of my neighbor. They appear to be saying the enemy is the government.
Yeah, no, I don't think the Tea Party is evidence of rising anti-immigrant sentiment, or for instance, I wouldn't say that's the case. I do think it's reflective of an almost inchoate frustration and outrage. I mean, it's hard to say exactly what the Tea Party is about sometimes. I mean, and I think most of all it reflects rising frustration. And we went into this recession more socially tolerant as a nation than we've ever been. We've got good reserves there, but I think the longer this continues, the more you'll see that frustration building and sharpening.
Now, you mentioned social tolerance. Before things got really bad financially in the United States, the first black president was elected, and Barack Obama ran on a platform of hope and change. So have you seen that at least have some positive impact, maybe psychologically, on these black communities in the inner city that you say have been hit so hard?
One of the great problems in inner city black community is this sense of resignation, this idea that's passed from parent to child that no matter what you do, it doesn't matter. You're not going to get ahead. There aren't going to be opportunities. And with the election of Obama, I think a lot of people thought that those norms of resignation would change in those communities, and I think they have to some extent. But if this era of joblessness continues and remains severe in those sorts of communities, I think you might see those sorts of ideas and that resignation returning.
You mentioned so many major social issues you expect this era of joblessness to create. What do you think is going to be the most damaging?
Boy, I think I do think that we're likely to see a generation of young people that's permanently changed as a result of this recession. If you look at Japan, for instance, Japan suffered a lost decade in the 1990s, and people who were coming onto the job market in their 20s and are now in their 30s today make up 6 out of 10 cases of depression and work-related mental illness in Japan. A decade later.
Do you see that happening now, though? I mean, this is a youth that was really energized when it rallied together to turn out in record numbers to elect Barack Obama president.
Well, that was early on, and I mean, it'll be interesting to see, what voter turnout rates are for young people in the upcoming midterm election. There are a lot of problems that perhaps we can't see all that clearly yet. But they just kind of continue to come out and come out and come out. And we know based on history that these sorts of problems, very specifically have come out before. And when I talk to young people and when I look at websites that are aimed at young people, I mean, I do see a rising disillusionment with politics, with the economy, with the job market, and to some extent a rising bitterness as well.
And you're saying the worst is yet to come, it sounds like.
Socially, I think that is almost certainly true, yeah.
Now, you mentioned earlier the impact of this kind of recession on Japan, but specific to America, there's this notion of the American dream that's really deeply embedded in the culture, that everyone believes that they can have financial prosperity and own a home. Do you think the American dream is over?
I mean, I don't think it's over. I mean, the U.S. Has come through periods like this before. I'm sure it will come through this one. I mean, this is not as bad as the Depression, of course, and we came through that. We came through the 70s, which were a really dismal period as well. So no. I mean, I'm not arguing that the American dream is dead or that the nation is irrevocably in decline. But I do think we're in for a number of very, very tough years.